The winter air bites at your cheeks, and the smell of damp straw mixes with smoke from distant chimneys, curling into the gray morning mist. You see her before you, hands roughened by endless labor, shoulders tense, eyes wary, standing upon a raised wooden platform. The rope halter around her neck digs into her skin with every small movement, a tangible reminder that she is both visible and invisible, both present and possessed. She is not cattle. She is not a commodity. And yet the crowd treats her as both, and the market square seems to pulse with the weight of this perverse theater. As the first shouts rise from the gathered men, imagine for a moment the strangeness of a world in which survival and humiliation intertwine so tightly. The frost underfoot crunches beneath the boots of farmers, laborers, and curious townsfolk, all drawn by the spectacle of a woman's legal and social displacement. If you find yourself drawn into these forgotten corners of history, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. Tell me where you're watching from, whether a misty northern village or a bustling city across the ocean. There is a wonder in imagining that we are exploring these human stories together, stretching across continents, decades, and centuries, connected by the same curiosity for the lives of those who came before. By the 1820s, the ritual of wife-selling had become an oddly codified performance. Notices were placed in newspapers with the same clinical detachment one might expect from livestock auctions. To be sold at Doncaster Market, the wife of John Thompson. Healthy, capable of household labor, able to bear children. No reasonable offer refused. On the appointed day, the husband would lead his wife to a platform in the square, the halter a visible mark of the transaction to come. Onlookers pressed forward, eyes calculating, inspecting calloused hands, the firmness of her arms, the intelligence flickering behind her gaze. Every detail mattered. Every judgment carried the weight of her future, her freedom or her continued captivity. Some sales were staged for appearance only, prearranged between the woman and her intended new husband. In one recorded case from Brighton in 1826, a wife was sold for 5 shillings to a sailor who had courted her secretly for months. She ascended the platform with dignity, her halter loose around her shoulders, and the crowd watched what they assumed to be coercion. Yet the transaction was a carefully choreographed assertion of agency. The crowd's role was crucial. Public witnessing gave the sale legitimacy where the law offered none. Without the eyes of neighbors and friends, the ritual would have been meaningless. But not all auctions were consented to, and some descended into terror. In Manchester, 1824, a woman was knocked down for 5 shillings. But when displeased with the purchaser, she was offered again, this time for 3 shillings and a quart of ale. The throng's murmurs escalated into argument as she resisted, and the local magistrate intervened to prevent violence. These moments reveal the fraught moral landscape of wife-selling, a practice legally baseless, socially tolerated, and yet rigidly performative. Consent was a currency as fragile as the coins exchanged for her, and even her voice, soft, defiant, commanding, could not always secure the outcome she desired. The mechanics of the auction were theatrical and deeply ritualized. Husbands called for bids, describing their wives in terms borrowed from property law. Strong and healthy, adept in needlework, a good mother, and with all her teeth. The men in the crowd stepped forward, offering coins, sometimes pigs, occasionally a small barrel of ale, calculating their investment in flesh and labor. Each bid was met with murmurs, objections, and discreet glances. Some wives, like Sarah in Yorkshire, managed to influence the proceedings. When a rival bidder misread her signals, she called out, voice clear and unwavering, "I choose Thomas Miller. No stranger shall buy me." The square erupted in murmurs, confusion rippling through the men who had assumed their roles in this grotesque theater. Her choice, rare, brave, and socially transgressive, was allowed to stand. Yet even victories like Sarah's were tempered by the haunting reality that freedom came at a price. The rope halter was removed, but the legal fiction persisted. She remained property in the eyes of law, now under the ownership of another man. Her agency had been exercised, but within the narrow margins afforded by custom, by prearranged agreements, by the community's tolerance. Life after the sale could bring kindness or cruelty, comfort or renewed misery, and there was no recourse if the new husband proved as unkind as the first. The market square had witnessed a transfer, but it could not guarantee justice or protection. Through these auctions, a paradoxical truth emerges. Humiliation and agency were inseparable. The rituals reduced women to commodities, yet the same rituals sometimes offered escape, survival, and, in rare cases, love. The transactions were messy, dangerous, and morally complex, but they reveal the intimate interplay between law, custom, and human desperation. As the crowd dispersed, coins clinking in pockets, voices fading into cold air, the echoes of the halter lingered. They were a reminder of the impossible choices forced upon women in a society that had stripped them of legal identity and rendered their lives a matter of public spectacle. And as the last shouts die down, one cannot help but wonder, who, in that frozen market square, truly held power? The men with coins, the community watching, or the woman who learned to navigate the treacherous space between consent and coercion, claiming her small measure of freedom in a world that offered none? By the time morning reaches the market square, the frost has left a fine lace of white on the cobblestones, and the cold wind cuts through the layers of woolen coats and shawls. You see her standing on the raised wooden platform, shoulders squared, hands calloused and raw from years of work, and the rope halter biting into the flesh of her neck. She is not cattle. She is not merchandise. And yet the square thrums with a peculiar energy, a mixture of anticipation and dread, as if every spectator has silently agreed to treat her as both. By the 1820s, wife-selling had become an almost ritualized event, blending legality, superstition, and communal spectacle. Notices appeared in local newspapers with the blunt detachment of a livestock auction. To be sold at Walsall Market, the wife of Thomas Parker, healthy, industrious, capable of household duties, able to bear children. No reasonable offer refused. The advertisements were precise, almost clinical, listing age, physical stamina, character, and skills, as if these qualities could be measured like weight or height. On the appointed day, the husband, often flushed with nerves and the residue of early morning ale, would lead his wife to the platform, the rope halter marking her as property to be publicly transferred. The community gathered, their eyes keen, inspecting every detail: the hardness of her hands, the steadiness of her gaze, the set of her jaw. Some sales were prearranged, carefully choreographed by all parties involved. In one noted Brighton case of 1826, a wife was sold for 5 shillings to a sailor who had been courting her secretly. She stepped onto the platform with measured composure, the halter loose but symbolic, and the crowd assumed coercion when in fact it was a performance of consent. Public witness lent these transfers the appearance of legitimacy, a makeshift solution in a legal system that offered no remedy for separation. The ritual mattered because it allowed a socially recognized conclusion, even when the law refused to intervene. Not all sales were so consensual, and many descended into fear and confusion. In Manchester, 1824, a woman sold for 5 shillings refused the purchaser, prompting heated argument and requiring magistrate intervention to prevent violence. The friction between public ritual and private will illustrates the moral contradictions at the heart of the practice. A woman's voice was her only potential shield, and yet that voice could easily be drowned by the din of the crowd, by the ambitions of men, or by the strictures of custom. The auction itself was a grotesque theater. Husbands called for bids, framing their wives with language borrowed from property law. Strong, healthy, skilled in household labor, a good mother, and with all teeth intact. Bidders examined her closely, gauging not only physical stamina but temperament, patience, and suitability for domestic service. Coins clinked in pockets. A pig, a barrel of ale, a few shillings, each bid weighed against the risks and responsibilities of acquiring a human being. And in that mix of commerce and coercion, moments of genuine choice sometimes emerged. Sarah of Yorkshire provides one such example. When a rival bidder misread the signals of her prearranged sale, she stood firm. "I choose Thomas Miller. No stranger shall buy me." The square erupted into murmurs and debate, the crowd caught between custom and conscience. Remarkably, her choice was respected, but even this rare victory came with its own paradox. The halter was removed, yet she remained legally bound, now to another man who could prove mercurial or cruel. Her agency was exercised, yes, but within the narrow margins the law and custom allowed. This intricate choreography of ritual, coercion, and occasional consent exposes the fragile human scaffolding beneath public custom. Humiliation and agency were inseparable. The halter mocked her autonomy, yet it also, in some circumstances, enabled survival, escape, or even love. The moral terrain was treacherous and unforgiving, but the participants, wives, husbands, and buyers alike, navigated it with the logic and desperation of those seeking any solution in a world that offered none. As the auction concluded and the crowd dispersed, coins in pockets, hushed voices fading into the cold air, the resonance of the halter lingered. It was not merely a token of ownership. It was a symbol of law's absence, of freedom measured in shillings, of agency carved from constraint. In every hand grasped, every coin exchanged, every voice raised in protest or consent, the market square bore witness to the human struggle between submission and self-determination. And in the quiet aftermath, one must ask, who truly held power in the market square? The men with coins, the community observing, or the women who learned to navigate, resist, and assert agency within the suffocating bounds of law and custom? The rope had been removed from her neck, but its weight lingered in memory, in precedent, and in the stark moral calculus of a society that had no other means to reconcile freedom, survival, and human dignity. Even as the market square empties, the air seems to hold its breath. The sharp tang of winter frost clings to the cobblestones, and faint impressions of rope remain, etched into skin like a secret map of desperation. You hear the echoes of coins clinking and murmurs drifting along narrow streets, and for a moment it is as if the market never fully sleeps, carrying the stories of women who walked away, trembling but alive, from auctions meant to define them as property. By the mid-19th century, the ritual of wife-selling had begun its slow retreat, not because of sudden enlightenment, but through incremental changes in law and social expectation. Reformers and local authorities often responded inconsistently, caught between moral outrage and practical helplessness. Some magistrates tried to intervene in Manchester or Derbyshire, only to be laughed down or ignored. Others tacitly permitted sales to continue, recognizing them as crude solutions to the impossible legal and economic circumstances facing working-class families. In some parishes, poor law overseers even encouraged husband and wife sales, seeing it as cheaper than maintaining separate households in the workhouse. Yet the human stories persisted, demonstrating remarkable cunning, bravery, and resilience. Take Mary Parsons of Brighton, for instance, who orchestrated her own sale in 1837. Her husband, prone to drink and neglect, led her to market with a halter around her waist. The buyer, a man she had long admired from afar, offered the sum of 3 shillings and a quart of ale, and she accepted, smiling faintly at the hush of recognition from the onlookers. In the crowd's eyes, she had been purchased, yet in truth she had exercised the only leverage the law permitted, choosing a life away from abuse. Her dignity was preserved, paradoxically, through the very ritual that sought to diminish it. The law, meanwhile, struggled to catch up. Prior to the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, legal separation was prohibitively expensive and almost unattainable for the working poor. Local constables had no clear authority, and national legislation treated wife selling as a petty nuisance rather than a crime. This liminal space, between legality and custom, created room for negotiation and survival. A woman's voice, her willingness to assert preference, could influence the outcome of an auction, though always precariously. In Halifax, 1837, a wife was first sold for a shilling, repurchased by her husband, and then resold to a man she had selected, a dance of agency amid social and legal constraints. Even when formal law intervened, it could not erase the human ingenuity that persisted. Women found ways to leverage market customs to secure new beginnings. Some saved small sums to buy back their own freedom, others orchestrated private sales, and, in a few instances, husbands and wives colluded to stage a public auction as a means of legitimizing consensual separation. The halters themselves became symbols not only of subjugation, but of survival, remnants of a desperate economy, of love reconfigured under duress, and of society's uneven regard for human rights. Not every story ended well. Some women were forced into repeated sales, their futures determined by strangers indifferent to human cost. Children were sometimes included in transactions, collateral for survival, their cries blending with the murmurs of the crowd. Yet, even in these darker episodes, acts of resistance flickered. A sharp word, a rejected bidder, a subtle refusal to comply fully. Each gesture left a trace, a record of the human spirit asserting itself against legal and social structures designed to crush it. By the 1840s and 1850s, societal attitudes were shifting. Newspaper coverage grew increasingly critical, depicting wife sales as vulgar, barbaric, and beneath the decorum expected of communities that valued morality and order. Evangelical groups, reformers, and new legislation gradually chipped away at the practice. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 began allowing wives to retain earnings and inherit property, striking at the legal doctrines that had rendered them invisible. Yet, the last recorded sale in 1913 reminds us that the echoes of these market rituals could not be extinguished overnight. Custom and desperation lingered long after law caught up. The paradox of wife selling, the intertwining of humiliation and agency, of coercion and choice, illuminates the broader social and legal blindness of the era. The rope marks faded, the coins exchanged, the crowds dispersed, but the memory of survival persisted. Each woman who stepped onto a platform negotiated her path and walked away carried more than a bargain. She carried the enduring assertion of selfhood in a system designed to deny it. And as the last halters were stored away, tucked into history's shadows, one question remained suspended in the frosted air of England's market squares. How much of human dignity can be preserved when survival itself is a transaction? Even as reforms promised new freedoms, the haunting imprint of rope and coin lingered, reminding every observer that liberty had once been measured, painfully, in shillings.